Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking with Gary Dorrien, and we're going to get into Gary's work. It's quite extensive, and I think have a conversation that touches on a lot of different things. Gary, thanks so much for joining us. I was hoping you could introduce yourself and include what you'd like folks to know about your very extensive political, intellectual, spiritual background.
Goodness. Oh, thanks, Luke. Well, I'm delighted to be on with you. And I love the idea of this podcast, what you're doing with this. I think it's great. There are two sides to my work, really kind of, and then another dimension that kind of runs through it on both sides. There's a theology, philosophy side of my work that deals with issues in uh, from the entire Christian tradition, Neoplatonism, Catholicism, early Protestantism, and so on, especially philosophy of religion issues pertaining to all those things. So I've a number of books that deal with. Homeland for me is that Kantian, Hegelian, post-Kantian tradition. Everybody in that Kant and Hegel and Schleiermacher and Schelling and Coleridge and so on, their impact on modern theology. So I've written a great deal about that whole nest of things, including on wider Christian traditions, not just sort of getting outside my own sort of progressive Christian stream, but also Eastern Christianity, which has got a Neoplatonist undercurrent, and Catholicism, which has this Thomist foundation, the Anglican tradition, which has got both a Neoplatonist and a Thomist foundation, and then working into a kind of Lockean liberalism in the 17th century, which then all of which kind of washes into the stuff that's closer to homeland for me, which is Immanuel Kant and Schleiermacher and Hegel and all of that going forward. Of course, going forward takes you into the 20th century, where then all of this is mitigated and mediated by American pragmatism and also by the Whitehead school, Whiteheadian process thought. So that's Whitehead and Hartshorne and people like that. So that's one whole side of my work is just tracking issues in theology and philosophy, and especially philosophy of religion. And then the other side is social, ethical, and political, not without a connection to everything I just said, because I got to most of it actually through theology. I mean, just even noticing. When I first started reading theologians, the idea wasn't, oh, I'm working my way into democratic socialism here, and yet I did notice as a college student in the early 1970s, all these great theologians of the 20th century, they were all democratic socialists. And so that has to mean something, and it takes me into something that then becomes the sort of the other thing in my life. Just how even this theology even sort of cashes out into some kind of social ethics, some kind of praxis, some kind of politics, and the like. Of course, that's the very period when liberation theology is coming, from nowhere, being born. So all of that is being mediated by what's just coming into play in my time, as well as coming in my own coming of age. So I've written, many books on that side of the ledger as well. Some of which are just purely political and social ethical, and others where there's a kind of mix and match, some kind of intertwining argument going on between them. Um, and I have got massive trilogies on both sides of this. I've got a big trilogy, actually, then later a fourth huge volume on American theological liberalism on one side, and there's a kind of counterpart to it in the work I've done in the Black Social Gospel and the social ethical side. And then there's something that both of these sides of my work have in common, which is that I do have pretty strong intellectual history bent. So it's not like at any point in my life I thought, oh, I'm going to I'm going to become an intellectual historian per se and write for those kinds of journals and so on. And yet it's a kind of natural bent of mind for me to take a kind of intellectual history approach to virtually all of these subjects that I've taken on over the course of my career, and so that side of it, the fact that I do am always sort of looking for what kind of story am I in when I'm making this argument, looking at these people, selecting this set of problems. There's a certain amount of genealogical kind of work that is usually going on in my books, which is why many of them are very lengthy books. So that's sort of the three the sides of it. I came into all this from an organizing background. I was an organizer for 11 years. Before I became an academic, I was not going to be an academic. I'm a child of the 60s. I mean, not quite. I'm actually a college student in 1970. So, I've missed out in the 60s, except I kind of grew up in it in high school. And so waiting for the 70s to begin, which never really quite happened. But involved in organizing, in solidarity organizing of various kinds. I'm almost a founder of DSOC and then was a founder of DSA. So that's just been a through line. And so was deeply involved in all of that and more for many years before my friends convinced me that I am a fish out of water and that I'm just denying this academic calling that I obviously had. I'd already written my first three books by the time that had occurred. So I came into the academy through the door of organizing. And it shows. I think like an organizer. I have this mindset of you're always looking to kind of pull people together and just not accepting that we can't do so. I'm now entering the academy at the very time when we're having just scalding debates about identity politics and cultural leftism and what's happening to the left of the social movements of the 70s and 80s are now the strongest thing in the left. And if the left itself is now entering the academy, which has never been homeland for the left before, until now, till this very moment, when indeed it becomes the place where the left is actually the strongest. For all that is both good and problematic about that. So that's where I came from, and virtually all these books I have that are out there, one way or another, mediating some set of problematics on one side or the other, or intertwining of all of this. As you've seen my the new one that's coming called Subjects of Justice, where it's basically a collection of my road talks. And I say there, I've got four well springs. So kind of try to help make sense to readers of what's coming at them from saying, well, it's all coming from one or more of these well springs that I've had from very early on. There's really nothing in this book that's coming that doesn't come from one of them. But it is a fairly unusual combination of things. So it's something that just needs to be explained just at the outset before I can even get rolling on a book like that.
I first came across your work through your 2020 book, American Social Democracy, and reached out to you about that. And it was interesting to hear your comment that that's a subject that people are reaching out to you about frequently these days. And I figured we could get into that book. And by way of doing that, bringing up the book you just mentioned, Subjects of Justice, Christian Social Ethics, Anti Anti-Domination, Usable Pasts, and Social Democracy. And if I could expand on one of those well springs of thought that you mentioned, you say that one of them is the democratic socialist vision of a society, and you elaborate on that, a society in which the economy and government are democratically self-determined, no group dominates any other, and every citizen is free, equal, and included. So I was hoping if you could explain where that vision comes from, both from other figures, other intellectual traditions. And then you've explained a little bit how you arrived at it, or sort of how this vision which is not unique to you, came to be yours.
First, I'll say a word about that book that you mentioned, because there were actually sort of two books. One was called Social Democracy in the Making, and that's about Europe, especially England and Germany. And that was 2019. And then American Democratic Socialism was 2021. So now it's the U.S. American counterpart of my European book. And actually, that European book was supposed to be titled "Imagining Democratic Socialism." That's the title I had in my head on every page that I wrote that book. But then my publisher said, "Oh, we don't really go for like that title. We want a kind of a history title that sits better on a shelf in a kind of category." And so we ended up going to Social Democracy in the Making. And actually, there was something a little off about that, because I was quite strenuous in making making a case for why, even though I'm very much in the social democracy stream of democratic socialism, there is a difference. And I believe that one can take you to the other. But there is a line that distinguishes them. And so to have ended up with a title that kind of didn't, that's not quite what I had in mind. I always grimaced a bit after it came out. But with regard to this question, yes, that title that you pulled out from, it's the very first page of this next book of mine called Subjects of Justice. And indeed, it's my definition. And it's trying to do a certain kind of work right away. I mean, to put a definition like that on the very first page means I'm going for what in the editorial business is called impression management, right? You know that you can imagine readers who have got some other idea about what this is, what that these words even mean. And so right away, I'm just working at trying to say, here's when I use this term, this is what it means to me. And certainly it's a definition that I think does pass muster for what I'm describing, to say you can get, I mean, this is something that Edward Bernstein would have agreed with, but also Karl Kautsky and uh, R.H. Tawney and William Temple, and various kind of exemplary, powerhouse, important democratic socialists of the late 19th, early 20th century. Certainly, I mean, my mentor, Michael Harrington, Mike would have signed off on that. He said, "Yeah, that describes it at a certain level of abstraction, because it is fairly carefully abstract, and it is steering away from certain other ways of defining it that I mean to say are not essential. I mean, so often it's defined as, well, between the two world wars, it was almost always defined as, where you just nationalize the major means of industrial production. That's all it, and with some kind of democratic politics associated with it. Well, I think, that to me is far less fundamental than what I named in that definition. So every word of that definition, I would stand by. I'm not going to say, well, I'm not going to give it a, well, it all depends kind of response with regard to this, because this is a definition that I think that holds up no matter where we are or what period of history, that does justice to what democratic socialist aspirations have been since the 1820s, before we even had this language about democratic socialism, because the very language of democratic socialism is itself somewhat self-conscious. It's dealing with the fact that, all right, we now have socialist traditions that are not very democratic, or at least not making enough, attributing enough import to democracy. And so now we're having to self-consciously name a certain kind of socialism as distinguished from some other. But those strains of this variable tradition that all go back to the 1820s, I do think that definition that I start with there, I think it does hold up as a way of kind of naming that to which we're aspiring in these movements, both secular and religious, and both on the continent and in England, and then crossing in other places. Um, you asked me where did it come from. For me, my good, where it came from. I mean, it starts with Martin Luther King. I read Stride Toward Freedom 3 times in the ninth grade, and King was just the formative lodestar figure for me, just growing up poor and rural in Michigan. And then there's also a question about that because King is getting something out of Christianity that's just utterly galvanizing to me. That it's just bedrock to me, and yet also introducing the problem. How come the church mostly doesn't sound like this? Certainly, the church I go to doesn't sound anything like Martin Luther King. So, what is going on here? How is it that this is a very powerful type of Christianity being lived out, and yet most of the church just doesn't sound like this at all? And then when I was later in high school, I mean, the next year, Dr. King was cut down, and now he's more than just a movement leader to me. He's something like a Jesus figure, a sacrifice, a martyr figure who died for us. And so now there is these cross stories, this Jesus story and these Martin Luther King story kind of meld together in my thought and feeling. And that's, I don't have, there's not a whole lot of theology attached to all this because I haven't read theologians yet, but that is bedrock for me by the time I'm coming out of high school. But the other moment here, though, that just answers this, where did this come from even for you, is reading Walter Rauschenbusch in college. Walter Rauschenbusch, the great American Baptist, democratic socialist theologian, the great figure of the white church version of the social gospel, a radical democratic socialist. And Rauschenbusch does speak directly to this question that I've had for years, because it's a brilliant, radiant defense and explication of a Christian socialist way of thinking about Christianity and about politics. So it's just a thrilling figure to me, despite the fact that his anti-Catholicism is just over the top. And I was raised Catholic, so I have to overcome all that in him. But he does speak directly to this question about if this is true. I mean, if this kind of social ethical way of talking about what the meaning of Jesus is, what Christianity should stand for, well, how come it doesn't? How come the church hardly ever sounds like this? And Rauschenbusch knows this is a problem. It's a problem for the social gospel. It's a problem for anyone like him who's saying, this is what we should be talking about, that so much of the church just prioritizes the wrong topics, and has for centuries. You can read Christian creeds without reading a word about love your enemies, do good to those who persecute you, turn the other cheek. None of that is in any of these Christian creeds. And Rauschenbusch says, well, this is something to be discussed. How it is that the church got to be something different from what the very teaching of Jesus and what he calls the religion of Jesus is. And so Rauschenbusch just kind of spoke to my condition, because that was my question. Why, if this way of thinking about the world and what you get out of faith, of a faith tradition, and now relating it to issues of social justice in the real world, if this is so compelling to me, then how come it's such a minority strain within Christianity? Well, he had arguments about, I won't go into them, but I mean, he had all kinds of arguments about why that was the case. And I have been in that line ever since. I think I'll just say one more thing about that, because you've already seen it. The first chapter of this book that's coming is a talk I gave in 1987 when I've admit my friends are right. I need to become an academic. So I've gone to teach at Kalamazoo College, and I gave this lecture it's kind of a spin off from my book, The Democratic Socialist Vision, which had just come out the year before, and it's going right down this line. So I make arguments in that book that I've been making ever since. And that have to do with, what is economic democracy and social democracy and how religion can be in it, but isn't necessarily, and kind of intertwining arguments and the like. So there is, once that lecture is in place in this book to come, it does have a kind of foundational statement to say, I've been working this terrain all along.
Your definition definition, I don't know if that's the word you'd use, but at least this sentence stood out to me because, one in different social activist lefty spaces, socialist, communist spaces, here's different ways of explaining what the future should be or what a good future would be. And some of those ways I think are more effective than others. And I think some of those ways are clearer than others. And I think use words and ideas that are more maybe important than others. And so using phrases, for example, uh, the economy and government, I think talking about the political system is important as democratically self-determined. This idea of non-domination is interesting. That was actually my introduction a few years ago into this sort of political side of Marxism. And I think that's sort of in vogue in certain sections of Marxist study these days, Marxist republicanism, Marxist non domination, so on and so forth. And then this phrase, every citizen is free, equal, and included. And I'll ask you in a little while this idea of equality, because there's certainly a section of the left that is not entirely comfortable with notions of rights and ethics and equality and so on and so forth. So I think we'll continue touching on that. How do you see the political side of this? I have here in my questions: would this democratic socialist society include a new constitution? When thinking about this goal of a society you'd like to see, how do you think particularly about the political project?
Yes. Well, firstly, I think I'll say I hope that I would have wanted to join the Socialist Party in 1910. Um, though, you're having to steer through a fair amount of kind of hostility to religion in so much of it. And frankly, hostility even to politics, to thinking that there's a kind of what I call magical Marxism that prevails in so much of the party of that period, where you think some kind of Marxist redemption will just change everything, so that we don't even really need to talk about racial oppression or sexism or anything else. That socialism is just going to be the answer to everything. And there was a fair amount of that belief, and Debs had a fair amount of it, of that kind of magical socialist view that then made it harder for people like me who don't believe that our only problem is just getting rid of capitalism. Um, so I like to think that I'd be one of this quite sizable number of Protestant ministers who nonetheless made their way into the Socialist Party despite the obstacles thrown in their way. I know I would have been in it once Norman Thomas is the figure who's the leader of the Socialist Party. Norman Thomas is a graduate of the seminary where I teach, Union Seminary, and he is that definition that I gave. My goodness, that's just straight out of. I mean, it's not like he said it per se, but Norman Thomas believed in equality, freedom, and peace. That's it. And to him, democratic socialism is just a name for actually believing in equality, freedom, and peace, and getting as much as you can out of all three at once. And to him, the issue is he actually believed that he was progressing, that the world itself was progressing toward those things in his early career, since, of course, he's a product of the progressive era. And then, of course, it's the shattering realization of his later life that is, no, the world isn't getting better in any way. And to him, it was shattering. And he was a somewhat kind of despairing leader of the Socialist Party for so many years afterward. And certainly afterward, Mike too, Mike Arrington, who was my friend and teacher. Mike has got this Catholic background, and he's a Catholic atheist. So there's a religion friendly spirit in DSOC when we founded it. So first I got to negotiate all these issues in terms of being in some kind of relationship to whatever to the socialist movements of the time. And politics does come into it in all of them. If there is a dominant strain of Marxism that says don't get tied up with that stuff. Don't that's not our business. That's just paralyzing. It'll tie you up. We don't need to worry about statecraft or what a good government would look like or so on. Of course, this is the Edward Bernstein critique. This is where democratic socialism came from in Germany, is Edward Bernstein arguing in 1898, 99, no, this is a problem for us. The fact that Marx himself really only thought of democracy as being a form of government, something in which he had very little interest anyway, since, of course, once the real revolution comes, we're not going to need any of that because government is just a way of shoring up capitalist privilege. And so Marx has a kind of quite utopian idea about whatever kind of governance is going to be necessary and what it is that the proletarian revolution is trying to accomplish. And Edward Bernstein, coming from the right place, I mean, he is a true believing Marxist who kept the Social Democratic Party together when its life was threatened in the 1880s and early 1890s. So he's got total street cred, and yet says this is a problem for us. That we actually don't valorize democracy both as means and end. It can't just be something about the revolutionary end that we get to once the correct revolution has occurred. And we're also, the fact is, our politics are better than our rhetoric about it, because we've got this pure communist manifesto version of what our ideology is, and it's actually in some tension with the fact that we operate politically in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect if all you knew about Marxism was the Communist Manifesto. He says, and so actually we ourselves are practicing politics in a way that we need to adjust our theory in a way that's actually in a closer conformity with the way we're actually behaving in German politics, because we don't actually behave like a party that's anti-political, or that just think this is all running for office and all the problems that inhere it are just bourgeois problems that we should have nothing to do with. That's certainly a strain in Marxism, and yet here's Bernstein saying and issuing it as a challenge to the party in 1899. We could do better in our theory. Well, as you know, I mean, this was just a bomb in the Social Democratic Party to be saying this out loud, because indeed they are holding on to, at the ideology level, holding on to Communist Manifesto revolutionism, and yet it's got this whole second structure of politics that's in a kind of uneasy tension with this revolutionary ideal. And the way, of course, they square it in the SPD of that whole generation was to say, as long as any political practice or policy that we enact or go for, as long as we can say that it's serving the revolutionary ideal, we're not selling out. So it's okay. And Bernstein said, come on, folks, that's not fooling anybody. And we need something better than that. Because indeed, it is being questioned in certain quarters. He's just spent a few years of his life in England, where he has seen it. He says it is questioned whether we actually believe in democracy or not, and they're They're not out of play by questioning it for us. So yes, I am in that stream. I'm a democratic socialist leading with democracy. That democracy is the means and end of socialism, and so that it needs to be political. And I am wholly on the side of those that say we don't opt out from the problems of politics and reformism, including reform movements, including all the issues, especially pertaining to race and gender and the like, that aren't just superstructural rationalizations of economic interests and can't be solved, therefore, by some merely socialist solution. I'm very much on that side of it.
Just to build off of that, it would seem, and at least this is where it's taken me, and I imagine it has taken you, though we can talk about it, that value of free, equal rights, inclusion, self determination, non domination would lead one to be very critical of the existing government that we have, governmental structure that exists in the country, which is to say, oftentimes I think there's a critique, rightly so, of the lack of democracy in the economy and the workplace. And in some sections, I feel the critique of the political structure, and in my case, particularly the Constitution, gets left in the background because one can say, yeah, I believe in democracy and equality, and that's why I'm a communist or a socialist or a leftist and want to change the economy. But one can also say, I believe in democracy and equality. I'm a socialist, communist, lefty, whatever. And that's why I want a democratic constitution. At least that's where it's led me. Uh, I'm curious about that.
Those folks who gathered in 1787, they disagreed about some really fundamental things, but they're all against democracy. I mean, the whole idea is to try to keep that down, keep it fenced off, keep barriers around it that just can keep it from becoming democratic. I mean, goodness, to all those folks, that democracy is the mob, and not just for them. We're 100 years later in this country, and democracy is really just beginning, even then, to acquire something like the moral connotation that it does acquire in the progressive era, which then ends up naming the whole progressive era, because that's what progressivism is. It's finally just taking that liberal stream and the democratic stream, these two traditions in American history that have been kind of rivals through most of the 19th century, and saying we need to kind of actually pull together, to fuse the best parts of both of these traditions in a way that now the party of democracy is now going to have a view about government that it never had before, but which we need it to play in order to be able just to get back the 14th and 15th Amendments, and just to be able to, get even what the Constitution we're supposed to have, get it back, much less get something better than what it is. That's progressivism. Just even the notion that we should be becoming as democratic as we can be, we're way, way, way down the road. We're past. We've already had two presidential elections in which the person who got fewer votes ends up getting into office. And it wasn't there was no great hue and cry about it in 1824 or 1876 or what was the other, 1888, I think was the other one. Because indeed the country, in 1888, the country is just acquiring the kind of democratic self-understanding, even the ethos that could say this is terrible, that the person who got fewer votes, gets in. Of course, in 1876, which was the great tragedy, we know what happened there. I mean, there you've got Tilden actually won the majority, and to me, it's the catastrophe, of course, because of what happens with regard to Reconstruction, and all of that. So, yeah, the liberalism side of it, liberal democracy, I do hold it as something precious. I will say this as straightforwardly as possible. When I find myself in spaces when people are just trashing democracy and trashing liberalism and acting as though and saying things like, "Oh well, our real enemies are the liberals," and so on. Um, I make sure I know kind of where the exit is. I kind of inch in that way. It's not like I leave, but I want to. Yeah, I can only really take so much of that because I now there's a certain threat that is kind of rising in me because I'm not giving away my rights to freedom to think what I want, to be intellectually free. I don't give that up to anybody for anything. To me, those are precious, and uh, I got whole all manner of things to say against liberalism, but not that. That part of liberalism is utterly crucial to me, and and I think that there is a tipping point. I've experienced it. I think it happened in SDS just before I sort of came on the scene. Where when you reach that tipping point and when people are saying, yeah, our real enemies are the liberals, then you venture into some kind of anti-liberal, illiberal, even if it's a liberal democracy, something that doesn't respect um, the rights that inhere in all of us that don't lead, that never do lead to a good place. So I'm not giving that up for anything or anybody.
When I was being introduced to leftism, socialism, communism, and so on and so forth, ethics and what I call here rights talk. So,
Mhm.
your statement, every citizen is free, equal, and included. Those are rights. It's loaded with rights. But talk about ethics and rights wasn't part of the discussion. And I remember a friend of mine at a certain point asked, gosh, does socialism have an ethics? Where does ethics fit into this? I feel myself to subscribe to certain ethics or to be an ethical person, but I don't know how this fits into my socialist identity. And perhaps one could say the same thing about equality and rights. I feel myself to be someone who believes in rights that people have, but I also find myself in a socialist tradition, maybe having read some Marx that doesn't always seem to smile favorably on that stuff. So I want to turn that over to you. Ethics, equality, rights.
I think I could start it this way to say certainly if you look at it historically, the whole history of socialism, there are all manner of people in it. The whole history of it has been chock full of people who are there basically for moral reasons. I mean, some moral claim has been made upon them that has brought them into the socialist movement. Some spellbinding speaker, some equality argument, they just feel in their bones. You look at even those people who gathered in 1875 that founded the Social Democratic Party, most of them couldn't have told you what Marxism was. They didn't really have any idea, but they were radical Democrats of a kind who've got some kind of ethical argument about freedom and equality coming together in some way that should have a politics. And that's what brought them into one or the other of these social democratic parties that then founded the SPD in 1875. And as you know, yeah, Karl Marx writes just a blistering critique of these folks, is saying, oh my God, these people don't know anything. They don't understand Marxism. And indeed, they didn't. So Marx has, he's still trying. And in the critique of the Go at the program, he's trying to set them straight. And but that this has been the case all along. You track it back to the 1820s, those earliest socialists simply asking themselves what it would mean for the French Revolution to actually just reach the working class, that it never did. French Revolution never did anything for people, for poor people. But what would it mean if it did? That's where socialism comes from in France. And then Robert Owen in England is the same thing, where it's moral. Now, Marx and Engels make fun of this at the end of the manifesto, and yet there's a certain grudging respect for it. They recognize, yeah, they've got most of it. There's a powerful critique of capitalism right there in Robert Owen and that whole strain of the cooperative movement that he does respect. He just thinks it's not going to change the world, right? It's going to hit a barrier. It's only going to get so far, because it's just moral. So he's got something. He is something better than that. But I would say, to come at this from below, the fact is all these socialist movements, including even strains of it that took pride in being, even strains of it that just fetishize their Marxism, people are being motivated by moral concerns that oftentimes they just can't even name, because indeed the ideology is saying, oh no, we don't have that. We don't believe in that. That stuff is squishy and soft, and we don't go for it. Cornel West is one of my dearest friends, and Cornell wrote his doctoral dissertation about this, just saying, he says, I'm moral. I certainly recognize my own moral aspiration. He says, moreover, I recognize it in Karl Marx as well. He says, and yet I wish I had read a book when I was in high school and college about the morality, the moral aspirations, the moral reason that's in Marxism. He says, but nobody writes about that because you're not supposed to, right? You're not supposed to believe in it. So Cornell, that's his dissertation, The Ethical Dimensions of Marxism. And it's so quintessential to Cornell, because certainly he thinks of himself as, drawing quite substantially on Marxism. Marxism, very, very important to Cornell, but very much on his terms that are ethical. It's just something he's not going to be talked out of on the basis of some ideological argument. All right, so that's a way of talking about it kind of from below. I could also come, what people might say about that, a way of thinking about ethics that might be even a little closer to what you were asking about that. There are plenty of people that say, yes, there needs to be a socialist ethic, that actually we would be better off if we did have something quite particular that's kind of orthodox to socialism, just the way Kautsky tried to define what orthodox Marxism is. We should have some kind of normative, ethical something that obtains in all places and all times, and so on. So for many people, that's what ethics is, right? It's not even ethical unless it's some kind of moral language that's normative, comprehensive, universalizable, at least, if not outright universalist. And so people who argue that way, well, now the question is, what's the moral theory underneath it, that could even mobilize an ethic of that sort? And here, yeah, there have been plenty of socialists who are just flat out Kantians. They've got Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative understanding of what ethics is, including a lot of folks within Edward Bernstein's own circle in the SPD in the 1890s. A lot of those people were straightforward Kantians. And people like Hermann Cohen and Ernst Cassirer and others, people in that Marburg circle, the late 1890s in Germany, are a very, very sophisticated argument for why, the socialist movement needs to be undergirded by a kind of Kantian transcendental ethical argument that would in fact apply everywhere, because its truth isn't just subject to context or history or some, local anything. It's explicating something that applies everywhere. So that would be a version of it. Now that mode of arguing does not cut much ice in England. In English socialism, far more utilitarian theory you'll find. Where you'll find people making a similar argument. Yeah, the socialist movement needs an ethical theory that's unifying in a way that a lot of our ideologies aren't. And certainly theologies aren't unifying. Theologies are divisive. But maybe if we could agree about a moral theory, that would be better. And certainly there are lots and lots of people who would make an argument like that? People who are in the John Stuart Mill stream of utilitarian theory, or even I would say this is a shallower version of it, but Jeremy Bentham version. I just said a kind of cutting remark about that, and yet so many of those folks who were in the English abolitionist movement that then becomes the English socialist movement, they're straight out of Jeremy Bentham utilitarianism. So here again, you've got folks who think they've got a moral theory in their heads that you can universalize. You can say, yeah, regardless of context, this is how it would apply. Here, I've there's a way of thinking morally that will help you solve your moral quandaries. That if you when you're in a quandary about what you should do, well, you just fall back on the theory because the theory will show you, will help you solve the quandary. And that that mode of kind of thinking ethically, certainly there are quite sizable chunks of the socialist movement then and now that argue that way. I'll give you just one other example of that sort. I know plenty of people in my generation, people some I'm quite close to, are people for whom John Rawls's theory of justice um, would be another example of the same thing, where they'd say, yeah, they're an updated Kantianism, full blown theory of justice that goes right, covers all the topics, and it indeed is. If you're just going to pick one, what's the greatest kind of theory of justice written in the past half century, past 60 years, it's probably that one. And there are plenty of people who've written showing how Rawls is only really consistent with a kind of democratic socialist politics and way of proceeding, which I think is a strong argument. I think that's basically correct. So here again, you would have these would all be ways in which you might say that's a way of saying yes to this question. Now, as you may have gathered, I'm not signing on to any of these things, and yet the fact that I'm a Christian, that I'm a Christian socialist, means that I've got some buy-in on this question, because yes, indeed, my field is Christian social ethics, and I'm coming out of a Christian socialist social gospel narrative that knows that it's situated in particular and isn't a way of just speaking religious Esperanto. It's coming from a place and it's got blinkered by particularity, just like any religious tradition and so on, and so is self-conscious about all that. And yet it would be just almost absurd to be a Christian socialist or any kind of religious socialist and say, well, yeah, I'm a religious socialist, but I'm in the socialist movement on grounds that have nothing to do with morality. I mean, what would that even be? What, you're just a total ideologue with regard to what socialism is to you? It's hard. It is hard to even imagine quite what that would be. I've known a few folks who come pretty close to it, who just want so much to believe that Marxism is just true in a way that the religious inspiration is so flattened out that it's just that. But that's a pretty thin read. And the history of religious socialism, and certainly the history of Christian socialism all over Europe and in the United States and in Latin America, especially with liberation theology, it's mostly very aware of what its ethical wellspring is. That it's just not part of your aspiration to say, well, we need to sort of get rid of ethics.
I became interested in it, though, one, through talking with other people, mostly through talking with other people who encouraged me to think about ways of communicating what's needed, which I come to agree with, around demands for equality and universality. And that plays in, of course, to politics. And it's one way that I think the conversation around the Constitution, for example, can be had, to say we need universal and equal rights. And here are the ways that those things are denied in our political structure. We need an equal vote. Okay, well, the Senate clearly does not provide an equal vote. And then once you get talking about universality, universal and equal rights, so much happens. One, you start encountering a section of Marxism, socialism, communism, whatever, that isn't comfortable with that. And so you start engaging with debates around that. Then, and I'll try not to lose my train of thought here, then you find people who, for example, Stephen Luke's books, Marxism and Morality, was very influential for me because Luke points out all the contradictions in that. Yeah, Marx says these things here, but he also is making all of these ethical and rights claims and so on and so forth. So you can't just say, well, look, here's this selection and, this proves X, Y, and Z. Of course, it's more ambiguous and contradictory than that. But also, once you start talking about ethics, equality, universality, you get into Martin Luther King Jr., you get into the civil rights movement, you get into Reconstruction and the Civil War. And so, I can't overstate how that has opened up so much of politics to me. Looking at King, looking at Reconstruction, when one incorporates that language or those ideas of ethics, universality, equality.
I think one person, one equal vote is exactly right. Um, when Nancy Frankenberry tried to made her historic intervention in 1995 over um, cultural leftism versus, the more social democratic leftism that preceded it, and tried to say, we must not allow these two things to break apart. We must have, carve out ways by which these two now traditions can speak to each other. The one issue that she just framed out, just said, I'm not even going to consider this as something that's on the table. The whole issue, one person, one vote, that is just not in play here as something that can be debated. She says that was so axiomatic to her, even in what was an historic attempt to mediate a bruising conversation, to just say it is so fundamental where I'm just not even going to countenance a debate about it. And I remember the first time I read that, I totally agree. I think that's exactly right. This really is homeland for me. I have written this very large trilogy on the Black social gospel, and much of my work before I even finally faced up to being the one, because for 20 years I implored that somebody who doesn't look like me needs to write a comprehensive work on the Black social gospel, because it's only the greatest religious tradition we have in this country, and it's what takes you to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King didn't come from nowhere. He had mentors, and his mentors had mentors, and they're mindful of being in a tradition, and it's a tradition that came from this very problematic of people they've lived through abolition and the Civil War, and now gone through Reconstruction, and now are in a moment, the late 1870s, having to ask just the terrible question: what would a new abolition be? I mean, yeah, a different political moment. So we can't just give that old abolition sermon anymore. And yet, what would a new abolition be in this context, where the 14th and 15th Amendments were just passed the day before yesterday, and now they're being eviscerated much of the South. And you've got this just mania of racist lynching going on. And where are the protest organizations that are just pushing back against any of that? And that's what the Black social gospel is. It's people building protest organizations to push back on just even those three things. It gets terribly concrete. To say that's what we need. And they found an Afro-American League and then an Afro-American Council, which was actually getting somewhere until Booker T. Washington figures he has to hijack it. And then the Niagara movement that Du Bois founded, except that one sputtered and gave way. And so finally Du Bois says, I'm going to have to cut a deal with white liberals in order to build something that won't fail. And indeed, that's what they did with the NAACP. And now immediately Du Bois is sort of caught in the limitations of this very argument that we're in here. Because the organization that they built, the NAACP, is devoted quite specifically to restoring the 14th and 15th Amendments and getting a law passed against lynching. And Du Bois is always kind of chafing against the limitations of that. And he's already a socialist. So he thinks about racial solidarity and racial liberationism in kind of socialist terms. In fact, he kind of transfers a kind of socialist consciousness to black consciousness. And they have arguments about this within the NAACP because he's on the board of the NAACP, and of course he runs the magazine, Crisis, and he does fill his sort of global race consciousness in the magazine, and yet keeps being pushed back by people on the board saying you can't say that that's what the NAACP is because our business is these three quite specific things. And indeed, Du Bois gave himself to that work. Nobody did more work than Du Bois for 20 years in hammering away at just those three things. So he knew how fundamental it was, and he never said otherwise. He never said, even in his communist phase later on, he doesn't say, "Oh well, that was pointless," or "That's just bourgeois," or any such thing. Du Bois uh, believes till his last day that's just bedrock. You can't sell out the right of people to get even the rights that were won with blood and treasure the first time, and now we got to get them back. And my God, that took another 100 years. That's what the civil rights movement is. It's just trying to get back what was lost in the 1870s. This is also bedrock to me. I do believe it's not enough. I'm totally sympathetic with Du Bois when he later on leaves NAACP. He says, I can't just talk about this the rest of my life. It'd be much too truncated a politics that is just getting all that it can out of some kind of rights talk that only goes so far. Although notice, having even said that, that's all Bernie does. Bernie virtually equates democratic socialism with six economic rights. He doesn't even get into all this stuff about community ownership and public ownership and mix and match models and all that. He does the bare minimum with that because, gosh, it's enough just to mobilize a rhetoric about what it would mean for us to claim the right to have universal health care. Wow, that's a revolution in this country. And so instead of squandering, giving away rights talk and saying, "Oh no, there's something so much better." Yeah, really? I've never seen it.
I also was curious about Sanders and how Sanders fits into your discussion of American democratic socialism. Sanford Levinson's critique, Sanford, a political scientist, that he does not identify how the political system frustrates the ability to get a lot of those things that he's talking about, including the Senate. And of course, he is a senator. So I feel in some ways that Sanders is a good example of what we're facing. On the one hand, people who are very upset with what's going on are identifying a lot of the problems and not necessarily looking at the political system.
Well, firstly, I do agree with you that we need to be able to talk about how we got the Electoral College and what it is and why it's anti-democratic. And the same thing with the U.S. Senate. It's just designed to kind of hold democracy just to an utter minimum, uh, and be, and so I think you're exactly right about why um, that's problematic, and we need to be able to talk about it. And whether that's on Bernie, whether that this is he needs to kind of work this into his spiel, that's not a major regret of mine about Bernie. I believe that Bernie is utterly magnificent. I love him. I have an enormous regard and gratitude for him. I remember only too vividly. It's just too much of my own life remembering what it felt like before DSA was the size that it is, before Bernie even had the impact that he did. Bernie didn't create this rebellion, but because it's coming in 2008 and 9 and 10, and it's certainly coming in Occupy. Now you've got a tipping point that's been reached in Occupy, where just masses of people are willing to identify and say out loud how it is that they're just sick to death of having being outsourced and demeaned and humiliated by this system that isn't working for them. So, it's coming there in Occupy. And there's also a right populist version of this that's coming as well. So I think there are two kinds of tipping points that actually were occurring in 2011. And Bernie, God bless him, is the one person who's been speaking about this and to this all along. So he's the person most perfectly suited to then speak to that moment. To actually end up, running for president in 2015. Now, back in the day, he first checked it out with Elizabeth Warren because she had far more, regard. She was a far bigger name than he was at the time. And if she had said, "Yeah, I'm going to run," he wouldn't have. But when she said, "Yeah, no, I'm not going to go for it," he said, I'm gonna go for that as a platform. That's a discussion we had with Mike Harrington several times, way back in the day. Should we run Harrington for president? Is this the way that more people are going to just even find out that we exist? Because otherwise, people don't even know we exist. And indeed, this is why Norman Thomas ran 6 times. Not that he thought he was going to win, but it's just the only platform you have to even get to larger numbers of people. And so Bernie in 2015, 2016 takes a run at it. And what he did in that campaign, I think, is absolutely fabulous. And it changed left politics in this country, and I think almost wholly to the good. So I've just enormous regard for Bernie. I do have one deep regret about Bernie, but it's not that he needs to work some more civic politics into his argument. I mean, Bernie hit a wall electorally because he never broke through to black and brown voters. And I think the issue there is that he isn't willing to admit, to just acknowledge, and therefore deal in a way that's personal, that conveys to people that he recognizes that people of color who have been harmed by racism have no reason to trust him, that he actually needs to win the trust of people to whom he speaks directly and with a certain humility, and is willing to share himself, who just aren't going to respond to some white man yelling at them about equality. It's just never going to cut it for them, and it never did. And yet he just can't be talked down from it or made to see that he's actually hitting a wall. I mean, read the room. You are not getting through here. And that's with having, my beloved friend Cornell. Cornell did all that he could for Bernie to try to help with this very issue. And yet that this is a regret that I have. And of course, it's to the extent that this says something about a white left that wants to act as though there's just not something just so fundamentally constitutive about this country's drama and pathology that it has with regard to race, that it has business about this issue that are always fundamental. Then it's also a critique of forms of kind of lefty politics that thinks, oh, we can kind of put that to the side, or there's something, there's some class first version of our politics that gets us, beyond all of that. I have a theory about change. I think that major structural changes for justice only occur during periods of liberal ascendancy in solidarity with mass movements. All these forces have to come together before you're even in a situation where you could make a breakthrough, so that you can get Social Security or get a Voting Rights Act, or maybe could get universal health care. And there was a while there where it looked like, wow, maybe 2016 is such a moment. And we did lose it. But of course, we got some residual gains from that extraordinary moment that have changed the Democratic left. As so far as the internal stuff in DSA, I could say so much about this, but I think I'll just say one thing. As an old timer, DSA, once we got this Bernie bump, and now it's a whole different kind of organization. based on all the folks who have come rushing into it, including a problem with entryism. So we've got certain types and different types of ultra leftism that have come in that we just never had before, but have now come in because they can see, oh my God, DSA is the going thing, right? And they want to be where the action is. So now they come in as well. Um, when all that happened was in such a rush in 2016, 17, 18, um, DSA then adopts internally because it's organized around these caucuses, ideological caucuses that we never had before. I mean, the whole idea of DSA, we made it, to us, it was a point of pride that we're multi-perspectival, right? That we are a multi-tendency. We don't have ideological caucuses. This has been the bane of the left, that the bane, just divides into all these caucuses and they all fight with each other over who is more pure and so on. And we don't do that. That was our calling card for years and years and years. And then suddenly we become an outfit that where so much of the internal business of the organization is going on in these caucuses where you can only join one because the rest, all the rest of them won't let you join any other. And so much of the internal business is just going on there. And I certainly understand why it happened, but I do have some regret about that. It's just at a feeling level. It's hard to feel like you can have reach toward the whole organization, or even kind of have a sense of what the whole is, because we do so much of our business gets siloed into these caucuses that then kind of show up at the conference at the end. But it's a different kind of thing than it was then, and that had already that had already happened when I wrote American Democratic Socialism. So I did, describe it in pretty much in a hurry up fashion because the publisher's only given me like a few pages left at the end here. But we had gotten that far, and the question, it was very much a question though when that book went to press at the end of 2020. Are we going to be an outfit that's even going to be able to scale to be able to do what we're actually are developing the skills at doing, which is actually being involved in electoral politics? As you know, I mean, we got a lot of folks who are saying, "Oh no, we just shouldn't even be doing that." If we're really Marxist, we're a class first organization, or however you name this, we just that we shouldn't even be involved in that kind of work. So just even fighting to say, no, we're nowhere if we're not involved in ordinary political struggle. Um, that has had to be fought for at every step for several years since I live in New York City. Um, you know, the folks who were most involved in that struggle during that time, they created the greatest organizing culture I have ever seen. And it was quite remarkable in as much as there were some quite bruising ideological discussions, internal discussions that had by no means been worked through, um, at the time. And yet amidst all that, you had just the most incredible thing that I've ever witnessed in all my years of being involved in this here in this city. And then other outposts elsewhere where people are doing similar kinds of organizing in Chicago and Boston and other places as well, where really effective, politically effective cultures of organizing have been formed, and where people bond with each other and the like, to the degree that it actually produced the next mayor of New York City. Because this is where he came from. He didn't create it; he came from it. He was Ross Barkan's campaign chair back in whenever that was, 2018, something like that. And now here he is, the mayor elect, New York City. So it's just an amazing thing.
Asking about the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the significance of the Declaration to you, and how you think democratic socialists should approach the 250th anniversary. What I've tried to add to this is to say and I'm not alone in doing this, is to say, yes, one can recognize the hypocrisy and the contradictions involved in this project and say, look, this idea of universal and equal rights is expressed and put out there and has since been taken in various directions, far beyond perhaps even the intentions of the people who originally put them out there. But this idea of universal and equal rights can be embraced, and we can hold what exists, especially the United States, to that mirror of universal and equal rights and find it wanting and then use it as a jumping forward to something better. But I'll stop there. How do you think about all of this?
Yeah. Well, firstly, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is at least better than what it almost was, right? Because there were earlier versions where that third thing was really just property, which is the key to so much of what is not right, not good in this whole story. You can know what I'm going to say here, premised on what so much of what we've already said here along this line. I am never going to be out of step with a long black social gospel way of talking about this, which is focused like a laser on this very issue consistently over time. In fact, the greatest speech in all of American history, "I Have a Dream," once that's the blank check speech. That's the promissory note speech, which is what one of King's stump speeches on this very topic. That we were handed a promissory note, and we're way overdue to cash it in. This country is overdue to make good on it to us. But that's what we're here to do. And yeah, there are all the things that are problematic about what didn't get said on that day of days at that march, and the people who weren't invited to the platform, and they all carried the same placards, and it's uniformity, and it's the apotheosis of civil rights liberalism. And King himself, we distinguish between the earlier and the later King, where that's the line, where the King as the apotheosis of civil rights liberalism is that finishes out at the "I Have a Dream" speech, and then after that, just a month later, now those church girls are murdered, and now you get a Martin Luther King who's talking about just how sick this country is, and that he's not going to live to see the age of 40, and so everything else that there needs to be said about all that this is in here. But the idea that you kind of trash or give up, or just even give up what few things we have ever had sort of going for us in this discussion, to kind of let go of any kind of equal rights conceptuality, discussion, or the like, to me, that is breaking faith with something that's just the best we've got in this country. So no, I am for moving through it. And actually, this country has only even been trying to be a racial democracy since, 1965. I mean, every single year of the 1960s, it's almost too much to take in. And indeed, this is how we got a fair amount of just the cultural backlash against this whole period. It was indeed more than people could take, and it was exhausting and alienating. And so then, right in the middle point, even Mike used to say this, to say, well, actually, the 1960s even have to be broken apart, up till 1965 and then afterward.
You have written so much about neoconservatism and liberation theology, and you talk about those things as polar opposite reactions to the tumult and trauma of the 1960s. And
Yeah.
you have at least two books on that subject.
Well, the thing they have in common, besides coming from the same moment, is that they're both uh, kind of testimonies to a certain exhaustion and rebellion against liberalism. Now, they don't mean the same thing by it. I mean, who represents liberalism? To the neocons, George McGovern represents liberalism, not Lyndon Johnson. Um, And to them, a lot of these neoconservatives, are people who they think of themselves as being old style liberals. And it's liberalism that changed, not them. But because liberalism has now turned into some kind of left wing idealism, and it's pacifist, and it's not willing to fight in Vietnam, and it's feminist, they hate feminism, and so on, that then you get this kind of formation of what becomes the neoconservative intellectual movement, which is powerful. And it's a lot of it in the beginning. It's all liberals and former lefties, and some of whom are still saying they're lefties, but all in a kind of reaction formation against what came of the progressive movements of the 1960s, and which became the social movements of the 70s, which neoconservatism was always fueled by in being against. Because neoconservatism is always is able, the neocons are highly skilled at culture war and always able to turn virtually any argument into an argument about whether you're pro-American or anti-American. Liberation theology is, in some ways, yes, it's a contrasting type of reaction to the exhaustion or limitations of liberalism, although something operating with a quite different sort of logic here. This is whether it's Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru or James Cone in the United States. It's people who are trained in liberal traditions of theology and just saying, yeah, that might be fine in its own realm. Gustavo would say this, but it's you're just dealing with the problems of intellectual elites, who they've got their issues, but meanwhile you got the vast majority of the world's population are non-persons who are just not even in this discussion, that's going on within, in this case, liberal theology. And so there need to be theological traditions that are actually giving voice to the experience of oppressed people in parts of the world that just don't make history, are disregarded. And that's the story of every type of liberation theology. There are various kinds that have then immediately come once that kind of argument is verbalized. You had different kinds of black theology almost immediately. I mean, Gayrod Wilmore and J.D. Otis Roberts and James Cone are lining out quite different black theologies, but they're all versions of a kind of liberationist argument. Similar thing in Latin America. So they're both neoconservatism and liberation theology are coming out the same time, but are not, and both reacting against liberalism and a certain type of hegemonic liberalism, where a certain type of named liberalism is too powerful. In the case of the neocons, the original neocons, they're just trying to retake the Democratic Party. They didn't have this idea, oh, we're all going to become Republicans. The founders all said, I'm not going to become a Republican. I don't even know any Republicans. But of course, they did end up there once Ronald Reagan was running for office, and they ended up in his administration. That took a while to get to. Early on, it's just they're in an argument where they're trying to take over the Democratic Party. And the way I came to know so much about it, of course, is the fact that Mike was very much in this. Mike named neoconservatism, because a lot of these original neocons are cold warriors from what was the Socialist Party, and now they are in league with Cold War Democrats from the Scoop Jackson wing of the Democratic Party, saying we need to retake the Democratic Party from these McGovern liberals who've taken it over and aren't willing to fight communism, and who have sold it out to Black Power and feminism and all these other cultural radicalisms. So that's neoconservatism originally. And it has virtually no point of conversation with liberation theology. These are just two totally different things, but reacting to something in a similar time frame.
How how would you want people, or how do you feel like people should think about Michael Harrington?
Yes, Mike was the third great figure in the American Democratic Socialist story. for for the latter years of his adult life. I mean, there's Debs and Thomas, and Mike was introduced as the successor of Thomas before he really earned it or deserved it. So there is this issue. And that has not a little to do with how some of this neocon story then developed, because Mike became the leader of the Socialist Party during its last years. So that's a drama that is being spelled out through the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Socialist Party itself broke up in 1973. And Mike led the progressive. There was a progressive wing. Well, there were actually two progressive streams in the Socialist Party. And Mike led the larger one out of what had been the Socialist Party, and that became the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee in 1973. And so, DSOC is the one of the two forerunner organizations of what became DSA. And Mike was really the leading leader, shall we say, of DSA for most of its time as well. He was a fabulous speaker. He had come from a sectarian Marxist background himself in the 1950s. He was a Max Shachtman protege, with all that sort of implies, because those folks were operators. And they barely came into the Socialist Party and they took it over. They said they wouldn't, but then they did because they almost couldn't help themselves. The Socialist Party was pretty weak by the time they came in the late 1950s. And Mike was their youthful star for years. And so then he became the figure who was the leader of the progressive faction, who led a rebellion against the Shachtmanites in the Socialist Party that led to the breakup of the Socialist Party, which yielded Social Democrats USA, which is one of the founding organizations of what became neoconservatism. Meanwhile, on the left side, Mike is the bearer of this argument that there should be a democratic socialist tradition that maintains, in an organizational terms, the faith, the politics of Debs and Thomas. That is how we understood ourselves. We're not a party. We're modest. We're a mere organizing committee. We don't run people for office. We don't have a line. We don't have cadre. We've got Marxists and people who are definitely not Marxist. And Mike would get up at certain conventions and look out when we were having arguments, and he could look out and say, at one time or another, I've been with all of you people. I mean, I understand where all of you are coming from, because his own history was so wonderfully complex. And he did have a kind of emotive sympathy. So many people who joined DSOC, like me, joined because they heard Michael Harrington give a speech at their campus. And they said, I could be on with that. He's just a fabulous spellbinder, who wrote books that were a little too tied to their moment. So a lot of them didn't wear well. But I would say The Other America, of course, is a classic. And even his last book, Socialism, which he wrote when he was dying of cancer, that holds up pretty well. But Mike was a democratic Marxist, as he would say. Maybe this is to give people even a kind of a clue here, to give a handle here. If you do a kind of checklist of the whole of Edward Bernstein social democratic critique of Marxism, or kind of what's going wrong in the Social Democratic Party, the late 1890s and early 20th century, Mike agreed with all of it. That it's catastrophic and just not foregrounding democracy, not showing it's a fidelity to democracy. Mike believed in all that. So all the ways in which there's a kind of democratic socialist critique of what Marxism was becoming, what orthodox Marxism was in the late 1890s, Mike was on for all of that. And this is long before there's a Frankfurt School that said a lot of the same things, and they just took for granted a certain kind of humanistic Marxist critique of orthodox Marxism. Mike was on for all of that. And yet, he also had this regret about what was lost when you take the social democratic path, because he did recognize that it loses a certain socialist militancy that was there in the earlier movement. So once the issue is Bernstein versus Kautsky, he realizes that the social democracy tradition, which is his tradition, really did lose the Marxist militancy that defines someone like Rosa Luxemburg or even Karl Kautsky. And this tension is in all of Mike's major works. If you've even attuned to it, then you'll see it. That he is a social democrat, but a militant. And it is also in me, this argument that I've been making my whole career, that social democracy loses its soul when it doesn't fight for economic democracy, which is precisely what happened in social democratic parties that just retrenched to defending the welfare state. I think if you're not working at it, then you just end up becoming part of a system that's been defined by somebody else. And Mike, that was the spirit of Mike. It does distress me when I see him talk about it in ways that just, or I just think, oh goodness, it's just not him. But I get that reception history is a thing, and just only certain things are passed on, and everybody gets stereotyped. And then we talk about people just in terms of the stereotype that's been received from a past. And in this case, that he's this social democrat who is just for working within the Democratic Party. Even that part of it is only selective. Mike did not say, "Oh, we just need to be in the Democratic Party no matter what." He was totally selective about that. And in fact, he wasn't even making that realignment argument at the end of his career, as he was, earlier on. So there's just almost nothing in this picture that doesn't need to be quite, particularly named and looked at in terms of its history. But I do understand that Mike ends up being just the name by which some folks think he's just the representative of that being in the progressive wing in the Democratic Party that we're not for. So he that's just who he was, and he gets typed as that. Michael Harrington was so much more than just that.
Gary, thank you so much for coming on and having such an extensive conversation
Yeah.
with me. We jumped around and touched on a lot, and I just really appreciate your knowledge and your experience and coming on and sharing that with us.
Thank you, Luke. It's been a delight to be with you. Good luck to you and all that you're doing. I think it's great what you are doing.